I never learned Dr. Isaiah Merritt's first name from him directly, not once in the 2 years he spent turning up outside, whichever room I was falling apart in, and I only found out why he kept doing it after somebody else had already signed my last paycheck. My name is Georgia Whitfield. I was 30 years old that winter, working as a clinical lab technician in the core lab at Bellamy County Hospital, one floor below the oncology unit where he was an attending. Everybody on the 4th floor called him quiet like it was a diagnosis. He didn't do small talk in the elevator. He didn't join the birthday cake circles in the break room. He just moved through the building like weather nobody could predict, and somehow, without fail, he'd be standing near the blood draw cart or the specimen fridge exactly when I needed an extra set of hands, or an extra minute, or just a witness who wasn't going to ask me if I was okay in that voice people use when they already assume you're not. The first time I noticed him was during a mass casualty drill that turned into something closer to real when a highway pileup sent us 11 patients at once on a Thursday that had started out slow. I was drawing labs on a man who wouldn't stop apologizing for bleeding on my scrub sleeve, and my hands were shaking so bad I blew the vein twice. I heard someone behind me say, "Low," and even, "Try the other arm, the cephalic's better on him," and when I turned around, it was Dr. Merritt, standing there with a chart he didn't need, watching me like he'd already decided I wasn't going to fail at this. I got the draw. He was gone before I could thank him properly, already halfway down the hall toward oncology, white coat swinging like he had somewhere urgent to be, though I never once saw him rush. That became the pattern, though it took me embarrassingly long to call it one. The night my centrifuge died and I had 4 critical potassium results sitting useless in a broken machine with a physician upstairs screaming into the phone about turnaround time, Dr. Merritt appeared at the lab window with a spare rotor he had no earthly reason to be carrying and said only, "This might fit," before walking off again. The afternoon I got chewed out in the hallway by a resident who didn't like waiting for a hemolyzed sample to be redrawn. Dr. Merritt rounded the corner at that exact moment, said nothing to either of us, and simply stood there with his arms crossed until the resident found somewhere else to be. I started joking to my coworker Denise that the man had some kind of internal alarm clock tuned to my worst 5 minutes of any given shift. "Maybe he likes you," Denise said one night in the break room. "Peeling an orange like this was the most obvious thing in the world." "He's never said more than 9 words to me at once," I told her. I counted. "That's its own kind of language," she said, and I laughed it off, because the alternative, that a man that contained, that unreadable, might be paying that kind of attention to me, felt like a door I wasn't sure I was allowed to open. I'd been burned once already, back in nursing school, by a man who mistook interest for ownership, and since then I'd built a policy for myself. Keep your head down, do good work, don't confuse proximity for affection. It's a policy I suspect a lot of people in this line of work end up adopting, whether they mean to or not, because the alternative costs too much when it goes wrong in a building full of witnesses. Still, I noticed things. I noticed that he requested my lab specifically for his patient's stat draws when he had a choice in the matter, which technically he shouldn't have. I noticed he remembered, without being told twice, that I took my coffee black except on nights I'd been crying in the stairwell when I wanted it sweet. I never told him which nights those were. He just knew, and left a cup on the counter with 2 sugars stirred in, no note, gone by the time I looked up. The trouble started, as trouble does, with a mistake that wasn't entirely mine, though I carried it like it was. A specimen got mislabeled during a chaotic swing shift, one patient's results attributed to another, and by the time the error surfaced, a treatment plan had briefly gone sideways because of it. Nobody was hurt in any lasting way. The whole thing got corrected within the hour, but the hospital ran its process, and in a review meeting that felt like being slowly lowered into cold water, my name sat at the center of it. I hadn't drawn that sample. I hadn't logged it either, not directly, but I'd been the one who caught the backlog and rushed the batch through without triple-checking the chain, because we were short-staffed and drowning, and somebody upstairs needed answers an hour ago. The committee called it a systems failure. My manager called it a learning moment. I called it, privately, the reason I stopped trusting myself in that building. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters more than the romance does, in a way. I've thought a long time about whether that error was really mine to own the way I owned it, or whether short staffing and impossible turnaround times set every one of us up to fail eventually, and I still don't have a tidy answer. I've talked to friends who left other hospitals for the exact same reason, worn down by a system that asks for perfection and gives you neither the time nor the backup to reliably deliver it. I don't know if that makes leaving a defeat or the only sane response left. I go back and forth on it more than I expected to, even now. What I remember clearest from that stretch is Dr. Merritt appearing outside the conference room after the review, leaning against the wall like he'd been there a while, though I hadn't seen him go in. He didn't ask how it went. He just said, "You still draw the cleanest samples in this hospital," which wasn't comfort exactly, and wasn't nothing either. Then he handed me a granola bar from his coat pocket, because I hadn't eaten since 6 that morning, and walked off toward the elevator before I could figure out what to say back. I started pulling away from the job after that, not dramatically, just steadily, the way ice pulls away from a shore in early spring, imperceptible until one day the gap is too wide to call anything but what it is. I picked up shifts at a smaller outpatient lab across town, on paper just to supplement my hours, in truth because I needed somewhere the walls didn't remember my worst afternoon. 3 months later, I handed in my resignation at Bellamy County on a rainy Tuesday, cleaned out my locker into a paper bag from the cafeteria, and left through the side entrance so I wouldn't have to walk past oncology. I did not see Dr. Merritt that day. I told myself that was a relief. I was lying, the way I'd been lying to myself for 2 years about what his attention had actually meant. 6 weeks after I left, Denise called me on a Sunday morning while I was still in bed, and the first thing she said was, "You need to sit down for this," which is never how good news starts. She told me that Dr. Isaiah Merritt had put in a formal request, back before I'd ever transferred so much as a single shift away from the lab, asking to be looped in on any incident or staffing review involving me by name. Not because of anything improper, Denise was quick to say, practically breathless getting it out, because 2 years earlier, before I'd started at Bellamy County, he had sat on the review board that handled a nearly identical mislabeling error, except that time, the technician involved hadn't just been reprimanded. She'd been quietly, unfairly scapegoated for a systemic staffing failure that wasn't hers to carry, and 6 months after that, she'd taken her own life. Doctor. Merritt had voted against the finding at the time and lost. He never forgave himself for losing that argument, Denise said, and when I came onto the floor young and overworked in a department chronically understaffed in exactly the same way, something in him decided he wasn't going to watch that happen twice on his watch, even quietly, even from 1 floor away, even if it meant a man who didn't know how to talk to people just kept showing up wherever the walls were about to close in on somebody again. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after Denise finished talking, turning that over. 2 years of granola bars and borrowed rotors and a man materializing at exactly the worst 5 minutes of my shifts. And it hadn't been about me specifically, not at first. It had been about a promise he'd made to somebody I never met, in a room I was never in, that he wasn't going to lose that vote again. And yet it had also, somewhere along the way, become about me specifically too, because you don't remember a stranger's coffee order for 2 years out of guilt alone. I don't know how to feel about that, even telling it now. Part of me wonders if it cheapens what I'd let myself believe was tenderness, learning it started as penance for someone else's death. Another part of me thinks that's exactly what tenderness usually is underneath. Old grief, redirected into care for whoever's standing in the blast radius next. I've asked a few people what they think and gotten 2 completely different answers depending on who I ask, which tells me there probably isn't a clean one. I called him. It took me 4 days to work up to it, and when he picked up, there was a pause so long I thought the line had dropped. "I heard the real reason," I said, "about the review board, about her." Another pause. Then, quieter than I'd ever heard him, "I should have told you myself." "Why didn't you?" "Because the first time I tried to explain it out loud, it sounded like I was telling you that you were a project," he said. "And you were never that. You were just someone drowning in the exact same water, and I already knew how that story ended if nobody reached in." We talked for 2 hours that night, longer than the sum total of every conversation we'd had in 2 years of working 1 floor apart. He drove out to see me the following weekend, and standing in my kitchen without a hallway or a lab window or a chart between us, he looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man who didn't quite know what to do with his hands. I found that more disarming than anything he'd ever said. We're together now, quietly, the way most things about him have always been quiet. I still think about the technician whose name I never got to learn, whose worst day became the reason a stranger kept showing up for mine, and I wonder sometimes whether she'd find any peace in knowing that. I like to think she would. I like to think grief, handled carefully enough, can turn into something that saves somebody else, even years later, even by accident, even in a hospital hallway neither of us chose to be standing in that day. What I keep coming back to, though, is the part I still haven't resolved for myself. Whether I'd have wanted to know the truth sooner, back when I was drowning, and he was the only steady thing in the current, or whether some kindnesses only survive being understood after the fact, once you're far enough away to see the whole shape of them without flinching. I go back and forth on that one more nights than I'd like to admit.